So welcome. This webinar is called AI, a key driver of value for SaaS product companies. And I'm Steven Strauss. I am one of the co-founders and managing director of KUNGFU.AI. And for SaaS companies, AI is a product differentiator, and it's an ability to capture market share and to scale growth rapidly. And it's no longer a nice to have. It's now an imperative. We're already seeing AI-first software companies outpace their competition and reshape their marketplaces with a significant impact on valuations. Traditional SaaS companies now have a choice of embracing AI or risk being left behind. And we've pulled together a panel that I think is ideally suited to explore this set of topics. And so I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to go. And we really appreciate you being here. So as far as my background goes, I call myself a serial entrepreneur and former venture capitalist. KUNGFU.AI is my 5th startup, and I also spent 9 years as a general partner at a venture firm during the dot-com boom bust era. And KUNGFU is an AI professional services firm. We work with commercial companies who are operating companies as well as product companies, and also we have government clients. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about KUNGFU during the course of the webinar, but I'd really welcome my panelists to introduce themselves. And I'm going to call on Sanjay first. So Sanjay, if you could introduce yourself, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Stephen. Really happy to be here and excited to be here. Let me start by, actually I spent a lot of time in Texas, I kind of got started there, but my first introduction to AI was back at MIT, and so did undergrad electrical engineering, computer science over there, and my master's, and then went off to Microsoft, and then spent some time at McKinsey as well. And in the last couple of years, I've continued to work on AI, and after McKinsey, joined a firm called Norwest Venture Partners. It's one of the oldest venture funds, 50 plus years old, and got a chance to focus on enterprise software and consumer internet over there. And now I started co-founded a firm called Tau Ventures with a former colleague from Norwest Ventures. And what we really are excited about is funding and finding and supporting early stage AI companies. And what we saw over the past 2 decades or so is AI has just become so much easier to do today. And there wasn't really a pure play, or there are just a handful of pure play early stage investment funds focused on AI. And so that's what drove us to start the firm. We try to pride ourselves on being very entrepreneurial friendly, supporting companies. We've got a network of 70 plus advisors that are CIOs and CTOs at startups and publicly traded companies. And they're there for customer introductions and to help give feedback. We've done a first fund, which we closed last year. There's 20 companies in the portfolio. They're all doing really well. And we're off to our second fund now, and are excited about partnering with KUNGFU and other folks, and William here as well, and are excited about supporting AI first companies.
That sounds great, Sanjay. And William, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm William Chen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Iodine Software. We are a SaaS software provider, software as a service provider in health technology. And we provide a solution, AI-based solution, that ensures the clinical documentation integrity at hospitals, meaning that we check to make sure that patient documentation in hospitals is as accurate as it can be. By way of background, I have a computer science degree, and coming out of school, I ventured into product management at Oracle. So I spent my formative years, if you will, working as a product manager, and have understood how to build products for a lot of different types of companies, from very large companies like Oracle to startups. After business school, decided I was going to go out and venture out and start building my own company. Prior to Iodine, together with my co-founder, we started a company that was eventually sold to the advisory board company, which is now a part of Optum and United Healthcare. And moving from there into starting Iodine, we thought we could kind of take all of those things that we had learned from those previous companies and just kind of do it all over again and apply it in a different area within healthcare. Little do we know that the landscape continues to change. It's not just the landscape of healthcare; it's the landscape of technology as well, and that the old problems that we are trying to solve could be better solved by new things that were coming across the horizon that we actually had not known about, and that obviously I'm speaking about artificial intelligence, and more specifically to our purposes, machine learning. And so we were challenged with what it would take to build up a new company, embrace new technologies, and potentially see where things intersected between the old ways of doing things and the new ways of doing things, and where things could no longer apply from what I had learned as a product manager years ago at Oracle to how we were starting to build a product and build a company that was going to have to embrace artificial intelligence.
William, thank you very much. And last but not least, Ben Herndon is our new head of strategy at KUNGFU.AI. And Ben, could you please introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, I joined KUNGFU.AI a bit ago to head up the strategy practice and offering there. Very excited to be working with them and with their exciting clients, which it's been a fantastic experience so far. My early career was in digital transformation, where I worked with a number of companies that were adopting what at the time were fairly new technologies, network innovations, internet applications, et cetera. And I became interested in the criticality of the human component of success in those transformations. Went back and did a doctorate in cognitive science and was a professor at Georgia Tech for a number of years. But the lure of the private sector and entrepreneurial ventures drew me back. So I actually took a brief stint as the Chief Research and Analytics Officer at the Internal Revenue Service before I joined Vista Equity Partners as the head of AI strategy. My role there was working with their large portfolio of SaaS companies, helping to swing them around to becoming more AI forward in both the application of AI in operations, but as well as in enhanced product features. So quite a varied experience with those companies, and excited to bring that experience to bear with KUNGFU.AI.
And thank you very much. Well, I'm going to jump right in, and I want to ask my first question to Sanjay. And Sanjay, one of the statements that I made at the top of this is that AI is now an imperative, and I absolutely believe that AI is the new basis of competition. But I want you to explain to us what an AI-first company is, and why companies that are or aren't doing anything need to understand who they're up against as we enter this new era. Sanjay?
Sure. And I'd say that there's probably a whole lot of definitions of AI first, but let me try to give one. And let me just take a step back and put it in a bit of context here. If we take go back 20 years or so, we saw internet first oriented companies as companies went online, and in that case, the entire product or service was oftentimes .com related. And if we go back about 10 years ago, maybe starting in 2008 or so, we saw the beginnings of mobile first companies. These are companies that, primarily the product or service was being done on a mobile device. There's certainly many examples before that, but where a huge number of companies were using things like location-based services and the unique aspects of mobile devices to deliver services. So things like Uber, Airbnb. And then in the last 3 to 5, maybe fast forward 5+ years ago, we started to see cloud first and data first companies. And the reason I bring these up is today, AI, as many people have said, has been around for a long time, but we're seeing this resurgence of AI first companies. In some ways, we needed a bit of the ingredients of all these other first revolutions to happen to get us to this point. Because for AI first companies, one of the key underpinnings is having a great data model. the other key underpinning is having ability to create really good models. And along with that comes with really good processing capabilities, whether it's GPUs or in the cloud. And so we started to see the ingredients of it. And today that really sets the tone for the level of AI first companies. And so AI first companies, the way I think about it is, these are companies where predominantly the product or service being delivered is AI powered. And so if you took the AI out of the equation, product or service wouldn't really work. And that's not to say that there can't be AI oriented companies or AI forward companies, which are using AI to supplement what they're doing. But AI first companies to me is, if we took out the data, if we took out the model, the product's going to break. Kind of like a networking company, if you took out the connectivity, the networking company would break. Or if you took out the .com company would break. And picking up on that, so what I think we've seen in our portfolio, we've got a couple good examples of AI first companies. I think you can also take a look at all of the larger tech companies and see what they're doing to become AI first as well. So I'll give maybe an example from both. A couple years back, if you take a look at how Google changed what they were doing, and Google came from mobile first search.com, mobile first, and then AI first. You can see it in a lot of products they're doing. Maps is AI enabled, usually can give you directions to where your next place to go is. The Photos app has a lot of AI first aspects to it. More closely at the startup side, we've got a portfolio company. It's called Iterative Scopes. And what they do is they capture the feed of a gastroenterology exam from a scope, and they create bounding boxes and identify things which are potentially cancerous polyps. That's the key aspect of their service. If you took out the model, actually the several models they have, they wouldn't be able to do that. And so that's a good example of kind of big one. But what we're focused more on is smaller companies which are finding specific workflows and then building these models tightly coupled with a unique data set to power their AI first strategy.
That's awesome, Sanjay. And I'm going to come back to you in a little bit and ask you why traditional companies should be paying attention to the fact that AI first companies are out there and the implications. But I actually want to transition over to William to pick up on this theme. So William, you've been running Iodine Software for a long time now, and you started out as a traditional SaaS software company. And in a very early stage of the company, you started embracing AI, and you've been on a journey since then. Yep. Can you share your experience set of how that's gone, but also why you started to lean into AI so early, and why you are, doubling and tripling down now? Sure.
Yeah. So I think Sanjay brings this up, and he talks about specific workflow, and it's a specific problem. When we started out, we had a specific problem we wanted to solve, which is that we wanted to identify documentation inaccuracies in a hospital record. And how do you do that, right? And so we started out by doing what we did best. I kind of alluded to this, in past lives, you look at that problem, you look at that typical computer science problem, you says, well, there's a heuristic in which people try to answer this question. So let's build a set of rules around that, that pretty much mimics that heuristic. And then we're ready to go. We can go ahead and implement that, and we'll have solved the problem. Well, guess what? We didn't solve that problem. Rules were inadequate for this kind of work that we were doing. And again, something else that Sanjay alluded to is that these are human decision problems. And we were trying to apply very simplistic computer science rules to these human decision problems. Clearly inadequate in terms of trying to solve that. And that's where we kind of started to look elsewhere and say, how else can we solve this problem? What are the other tools available? And that's where we started to look at the application of machine learning models, the use of processing large amounts of data to try to mimic the decision processes that humans would go through if they were trying to determine the diagnosis of a patient, or if they were looking at documentation to see if that documentation accurately reflected what the patient was encountering. So that was the light bulb that kind of went on for us. The old ways, the rules, the simplistic, now we view that as simplistic ways of addressing the problems were just no longer applicable. We would be doing our customers a disservice, or worse, they would not become our customers if we give them that solution, right? Because it didn't ultimately solve their problem. So that's kind of the genesis of how we embarked on this. And the other thing I probably want to add, again, Sanjay touched on this, is the data. I think one of the prerequisites of becoming an AI first company is having access to lots of data. The work that AI requires, the work that AI does requires a lot of data. And so it's important to have lots of data. It's important to have lots of well-curated data. You can't just, the old adage applies, garbage in, garbage out, right? You want lots of data. You don't want just to cram garbage through a machine learning model. You cram garbage through it, you get a garbage result. You want to make sure you get good data and lots of it.
Great, thank you, William. So I'm going to turn to you, Ben. In your background and through your career, you've had I think you bring a really interesting perspective to this question or sets of questions around what the basis of competition is going forward, how you get return on investment in AI, and differentiation. So I would really welcome your perspective from Vista Equity and now working with KUNGFU on this very topic of the return on investment of being an AI first or AI forward company. Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you've heard, I think there are certainly examples. I mean, the world is rife with examples of very self-evident ROI positive situations where you can apply AI either to improve operations, efficiencies, speed, accuracy, and quickly get a benefit from those activities. The question of, what is the ROI of being an AI first company? Again, some instances where it's very self-evident, right? I think Iodine is a great example, right? Because their company set out to solve a problem. AI clearly presented itself as the most effective way to solve that problem. And so that adoption, that AI forward first decision was almost, a natural consequence of the strategy they were pursuing. For other companies, it may not be quite as self-evident. For them, it may be, what is the nature of how their marketplace is moving? What are customers expecting from interactions with their product and services? What kinds of competitors are emerging, or what are their legacy competitors doing to leverage AI in these spaces? So it requires a much more holistic view of what's going on in your marketplace, and how AI can serve to give you a sustainable competitive advantage through successful application. And I think in a lot of those instances, it really is focused on product and service, but I've certainly worked with a number of companies where that advantage can come in on the operational side, right? The speed with which you can process data, bring new products to market, stay abreast of changes in everything from pricing to product. So I think it's not limited to a one size fits all, certainly. One of the questions that I was asked quite a bit was, well, we're not sure yet, if we're going to be AI first, so do we really need an AI strategy? And my answer was always absolutely, because somebody somewhere, whether it's your investors or your customers, or an acquirer, is going to ask you, what are you planning in this space? Where do you see this space going for your company? And if your answer is, we haven't really thought about it yet, that's really not an adequate answer. I mean, if you say we've thought about it and we've rationalized that we don't see the marketplace going this way, or we think that this investment for now will position us to take advantage of changes in the future, that's a rationalized approach. But to say, well, we still think there's too much mysticism around AI, too much uncertainty, I think those are not necessarily true. I know we've all experienced that uncertainty and that mysticism, but for most companies, they need to start getting past that and having a rationalized approach to what their AI is going to look like in the future.
Yeah, Ben, I agree with you. You know, if you're exiting in the next year, you probably don't have to worry about it. But if you're exiting, you know, 2, 3, 5 years from now or beyond, to me, it's very much like having woken up in the year 2000 and say, oh yeah, we're going to continue to compete based on doing business with faxes.
That's right.
And I think that's the analogy here. The other part of ROI that I really think of, and Sanjay, I'm going to turn this over to you in just a second, is also the valuation multiple expansion. You know, I think that if you execute well on an AI plan, you're not just going to be able to compete better, you know, faster growth and bigger bottom line, but you'll also get rewarded in the marketplace for leaning in as opposed to, you know, not doing that. So Sanjay, I want to hear a little bit more from you about that specific aspect of ROI. And I'd like you to tie it in, if you can, to how the AI first companies that you're funding today, what you think they're going to do from a disruption point of view to companies who are, you know, like an ostrich keeping their head in the sand around AI.
Yeah, and you know, I'd agree. You know, every company needs to have some AI strategy, and it can't just be the data science team. It's got to be a real AI team coupled with them or separate. So I think we're going to see, you know, significant. I mean, we've already seen quite a bit of disruption across the ecosystem, and I think a lot of times where we're seeing it is behind the covers, where you're not quite seeing the AI deployed, but and that's oftentimes done on purpose, where you see, you know, a front end, which is maybe more of a traditional app front end, and then some decision logic, which is being powered by the AI, and then you're getting the output response. And now I think what we'll see, and there's examples of this coming out to the forefront as well, where the AI is much more visible, such as AI first companies, which if you where you're seeing the direct output from the AI. And so let me just give a couple examples of things, you know, of an AI first strategy, which could be totally different than kind of an AI supplemental strategy. So an AI first company, let's take insurance, for example. An AI first company there would ingest data and use AI to do real-time decision logic on whether to approve a claim or not. And that decision logic of happening within 30 to 45 seconds is a source of their competitive advantage to attract customers and retain customers. Whereas another company may use AI to audit what happens in their insurance claim process. And as AI starts becoming closer to the endpoint, you'll see things that are faster service, better decision logic, which would then help become sources of competitive advantage there.
Yeah, I'd like, if it's all right, Stephen, I'd like
Please.
to jump onto that a little bit too. You know, this idea of sort of, I think you used the term supplemental versus really AI forward, is something that, you know, I'd say a few years ago, a company would say, yes, we have AI, it's here in this function that you can visibly see in our product. But, you know, at Vista, and I think increasingly across, you know, the corporate ecosystem, we're really able to see whether there's a there, right? So if you're doing diligence on a company that you're acquiring, you can tell if there really is, you know, an AI capability in that organization. Mm-hmm. And I think that really distinguishes an AI forward company from another one, in that they're really able to sustainably reproduce those kinds of AI-based advantages and innovations. And I think it's those companies that, you know, really at Vista, and I think, you know, there's other examples, obviously, in the broader economy, where you are seeing increased multiples as a result of being able to demonstrate those capabilities. And you're also seeing companies being acquired specifically for those capabilities.
Yeah, William, your company recently went through a transaction.
Yep.
And you know, I'd welcome you talking about how your new investors and you as a company, you know, see all this, you know, from a return on investment point of view. But I'm also struck by something that we talked about in preparation, which was, you know, as a company serving the healthcare market, which is evolving very fast, and then AI also evolving very fast. How are you managing, that very fast moving and fluid situation? So if you could bring those two together, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I think on the one hand, right, we look at AI and going back to this message of AI first. AI needs to infuse everything that we do, because we do believe it is a better mousetrap. It is a better way to solve a lot of problems, not all problems, but a lot of problems, and especially in our domain, especially in healthcare. And I'm sure there are other domains where it can be applicable as well. The other thing that we do is we want to ensure that the organization permeates and lives and breathes AI, so much so that, for example, some of the internal tools that we use to ingest the data that we get from our healthcare providers. But you know what? We use AI internally. This is not something that's ever client-facing or anything like that. We use that to parse the information that we're getting, because the previous process was just too slow. It required too much human intervention, and we decided that an AI-based approach would be much better. And so I think an organization that wants to be AI first is always looking kind of almost from the lens of AI at all the problems. And not that it applies to everything, but you always look at it and say, can AI apply to this particular problem? What are the characteristics where AI will make a difference? And can we build something that will solve that problem? So we look at not just the internal stuff, but the external problems that are being brought to us by our clients, and say, can we apply an AI solution to that? And then the second part of that is then this is where we've been blessed with the relationship with KUNGFU, is then what AI solution do we apply to this particular problem, right? In our early stages, we're very simply we're taking one type of model, and I think I've talked about this in the past. Gradient boosting models. We take a gradient boosting model as one potential machine learning model and apply it to everything that we could get our hands on and see if it worked. And it applies to certain degrees, right? But then the next thing you do is you take a look at it and say, well, what's the next? How do we get that prediction, that capability to the next level? Maybe we need to bring on a CNN model, something that was a little bit more time-based, right? So we have to go out and look for a new algorithm. The problem is we are the subject matter experts in the business that we're in. We are healthcare technology experts. And while we're also AI proponents and experts in the application of healthcare, we are not always seeing the breadth and change of what AI, machine learning, the algorithms are changing and expanding and growing at a very rapid pace. And that's where the partnership with an organization like KUNGFU provides that advice, provides that oversight for us to say, hey, we understand your business, but we're the experts in AI in general. We understand what you're trying to solve here. Have you considered using this approach, this other approach? We've been scanning the new technologies coming out from all these other vendors. Maybe this approach would apply to your specific problem here in healthcare. And so I think for us, that I think is how we continue to grow and expand in our expertise, not just in healthcare, not just in solving that healthcare problem, but being the provider of AI solutions for our particular part of the world.
Well, William, I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate your kind comments. I want to draw a conclusion from what I've heard, which is the companies that are represented by Sanjay and your company, William, Iodine Software, the support for AI, the AI investment and strategy is coming from both the board level and the C-suite, and it's not from bottoms up. Is that correct?
Yes. And it's, I say it is, yes, but it's also in response to solving the problem, right? Our boards are they recognize what we do, right? We're trying to solve a problem in healthcare. And if AI is the best solution for that problem in healthcare, then they come back to us and they say, you go all in on that, because we believe that AI can solve that problem. You believe, you're the experts, you recognize that AI can solve that problem. We're all in with you, right? So that's how our board, our investors look at the role of AI within the purview of our company and our mission.
Sanjay and Ben, I'd like to hear your perspectives on, for the companies that that you've seen that have been most successful in this space, where that support's coming from, and why that's important.
Yeah, and just picking up where William left off, actually, what we often look for is some workflow, some actual subject matter experts in the area, partnering with a good AI strategy, because ultimately you need to figure, at least for us, what we filter on a bit is applied AI. So where is it actually being applied? Not AI for the sake of just simply a new model. That there's a lot of research institutes for that, or you can go on GitHub or Algorithmia or any number of sites and find or academic papers and find that. But trying to figure out what model to apply where and to which workflow is actually is very challenging. And so I think it requires both subject matter expertise on that workflow, especially in domains like healthcare. We've got a drug discovery company that is revolutionizing drug discovery and is doing it all in software and AI. And that's billions of dollars spent, but the opportunity there is huge. But you have to be a real great scientist, and you have to partner and marry that with really deep AI expertise. We've got a cybersecurity company, same thing, where there's so many open source tools to run different cybersecurity tests. What often happens is you get inundated with alerts. So you need to have someone who understands cyber, but also someone who can understand AI to say, well, if I have 3,000 alerts, how do I effectively navigate this and then make decisions within some reasonable period of time to identify false positives and false negatives? So that requires a measure of different AI models and figuring some sort of closed loop system to get feedback. And so what we're often filtering for is does the team have real true subject matter expertise? Have they identified at least one workflow? And then do they have the right data capture and AI capabilities to then truly apply and build some competitive proprietary models, which are sustainable over the long term as well, and a source of competitive advantage to that workflow? And then I think then things start clicking really well when those ingredients come together.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a great way to articulate it. From my experience, so not dealing with startups or venture companies as much, but more established companies that are trying to be more AI forward. I think the workflow component is absolutely critical, right? Solve a problem, understand how it contributes, to your bottom line or top line. But I think, to sustain that transformation, you getting past the ability of people in a board meeting to say, we're doing AI, right? We've checked that box, but to really keep it going and make it successful in transforming that company into being AI forward is about making sure that the leadership is aligned on a vision for what role AI is going to play, right? So, William mentioned, the centrality of AI in solving their business problem. That is not always an easy thing to articulate or craft for some of these companies that are trying to steer the direction in which they're going. So I think not only articulating it, but making sure that leadership is aligned around that, so that when they hit those rough spots or those questionable return spots, they're able to persist to see the real benefits, of these investments.
And I think, if I may, just kind of piggybacking on that, the organizational structure or the organizational thinking also probably has to change to embrace AI. One of the things I alluded to, kind of my background in product management and all that, is that AI, the outputs of AI are not as a guarantee, if you will, as your deterministic coding practices that I was familiar with, right? You can't write a set of requirements and say, I want I want these 5 things on screen, and they're going to display this at this point in time. And 2 months later, your programmer, your coder completes that. That kind of requirement doesn't always pan out with AI. You can say, I want the ability to identify heart failure or some kind of cancer with a 90% level of precision. You may or may not be able to get there. There's a creative process behind it, and you certainly may not get there in the time frame that you've prescribed for the team. Right? You say, I want to get 90% precision in 90 days. Well, you'll come back to you say, we'll do our best and we'll try different things, but 90 days is not a guarantee. Nor can we guarantee 90% or whatever that number is. And so management, investors, the C-suite all have to rethink what the requirements are, what the expectations are when you're trying to embrace an AI solution.
So for those people on the webinar, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel. And we actually have a question that relates to AI strategy applied internationally. And so does anyone have any experience with companies that are trying to apply AI solutions across multiple cultures, verticals, and including emerging and developed countries? Or is everyone operating, in the context of a North American business environment?
My business is US only. Sorry, yeah. That's my answer.
A number of the companies I've worked with, have an international component. The biggest challenge I would say is, data standards. So if you're dealing with data that you're bringing in from 10 different countries that are all being brought into the same space and applied in the same models and products, but they don't always come from the same sort of basis of data governance, right? So you have to be very careful about, making sure that there is a common set of standards and there is a stewardship for that data that, makes the output of that model valid.
Yeah.
Just on our end, we've seen quite a few companies find access to data internationally, oftentimes easier than in the US. And, one of the things is that cold start problem, which is where do you get started? And so oftentimes, at least what we see with startups is they go to Kaggle or they go to some place where you can get some data, and everybody has that data. And so that only gets you so far. And so what we've noticed is in certain other countries, oftentimes getting access to data is a little bit easier at times than here. And so, training that may not be able to apply it in production out here, but to start getting things going, we've seen some companies figure out different models of acquiring data internationally, even through launching a small app or some software product as a collection mechanism, and then maybe that app is retired and they launch a different service here. But it's an interesting way to start the engine on the data side.
And I'll answer the question by saying that it's a little bit remarkable that our 30 plus clients have been so focused on the North American market and not terribly international. But there are real issues as it relates to data and cultural norms, et cetera, as it relates to how data is collected, how it's used, and even how predictions are then applied. So I think it's actually a really great question. I think we all will be grappling with it. We will all be grappling with it. It's just quite early in this transition to AI being the new basis of competition that we are not seeing as much of it as we will be. So the other question, another question that's in the Q&A panel is a question around everyone's perspective along responsible AI and ethics as it relates to AI, privacy, fairness, and bias mitigation. So does anyone want to take that on?
Well, let me say it's a really important topic, and it's really hard to get right, but it's something that needs to be part of the conversation, I think. on any AI project. And let me just comment from there. There's starting to emerge some software-based tools that can help address this. And I think broadly, the space is how do we get to a world in which we have explainable AI? And in a couple initiatives, there's one I believe Google has done or has been pushing as well, which is how do you create basically cards around what is the makeup of the data. And so when you are creating a model, where did this, answering basic questions like where do we collect the data? When was the last time we accessed it? How frequent has it been refreshed? And is it representative or not? And so getting more visibility on those areas is it's a big initiative. And I think more attention needs to be paid on it. And explainability AI overall is an interesting area. So.
Yeah, Sanjay, I think that's a very interesting point, and then that's a very valid point. I think when we have explainable AI, people, then AI becomes a little bit more transparent, right? AI as it is, machine learning as it is today, is very much a black box. You cram some data in it, and it tells you some answer, and quite honestly, sometimes we don't even know how it came up with those answers, right? And so the more people can understand the provenance of that data, and in some way or fashion try to explain how that black box came up with its results, we will be on the way towards a better understanding and better bias mitigation of AI. I think the other thing that we've done just internally here at Iodine is recognizing that sometimes your data sets need auditing. Right, and so you need to go back and take a look at your data sets and know where they come from, and look at, because you're testing your data against some kind of result within your data set. Well, what are those results actually? What are those results saying today? Are they unbiased? Are they real? At a very base level, are they even correct? And so we do that level of auditing internally, and I think it's kind of incumbent on the vendor, the provider of these AI technologies to ensure that. And hopefully one day we too will be able to be transparent about the auditing work that we're doing and tell our clients, hey, here's how we came up with our results, and here's how we ensured that those results were correct and unbiased.
And we have a few minutes left. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, to get past, the sort of verbal treatment. And I think a lot of companies, especially AI forward companies, recognize the importance of that, right? Make sure that there are practices, to William's point, that are embedded in your organization that are accountable for those outcomes, right? So, this is internal audit, tied into your KPI, whatever. Ultimately, understanding, what is it that the model is predicting? What's the output look like? And how is that output distributed over the kinds of things that we're trying to be cautious about and sensitive about, so that it does not create a bias. And, I think the challenge is that those biases can emerge in ways that many of us are not individually trained to see. So a lot of times it takes bringing more eyes in the organization, outside the organization, looking at that data, looking at those outputs, to be able to identify those biases.
Well, we are out of time. And so I really just want to end by saying thank you very much to the three of you, Sanjay, William, Ben. Really appreciate the dialogue. The high level perspective that we all have is that AI really is the new basis of competition, and that SaaS companies, have every opportunity today to embrace that for whatever that means for them. And really now is the time to do that. And so with that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who attended, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. So thank you very much.